In the winter of 1259, as the cold winds swept across the eastern forests of Poland, the villagers in remote settlements began to see strange shapes out in the snow-covered fields. Not wolf tracks, not merchant cart trails, but Mongol horsemen, frozen solid upon their mounts, man and animal alike locked in place, as if time itself had stopped around them. The horses still stood, the riders still sat upright, hands fixed on the reins. Their eyes remained open, but the glassy orbs had been picked clean by crows. No struggle, no final contortion, only absolute silence. No one came to bury them, not because of fear, but because fear had long since passed. Villagers set up makeshift stalls around the frozen corpses, boiling soup, burning firewood, selling bread on market days. Children threw snowballs at the ice-glazed armor. Dogs circled and marked territory the way they always did each winter. One baker even hung a wooden sign from a stiffened Mongol arm. Bread made from grain, not from human flesh, like those from the East. This was no longer terror. This was contempt. Because Europe remembered. They remembered Legnica, where sacks filled with human ears were dragged from the battlefield as trophies. They remembered drinking cups carved from the skulls of children. They remembered the days when 30,000 horsemen swept across the land like wildfire, and hundreds of thousands fell in the span of 3 suns. They remembered cities where only the cat survived, because both rats and humans had already been consumed. For 20 years, Europe slept under the shadow of that memory. But in the winter of 1259, when the Great Khan sent the heavy cavalry of the Golden Horde back into Poland to reassert dominance, they found an enemy altogether different. An enemy who had learned from pain. And in that winter, the Mongols far from home would come to understand what happens when you teach farmers how to become hunters. They had created their own executioners. If you have ever heard old family stories of war, of distant winters, of lives unsettled by history, we invite you to share them in the comments below. Such memories are not merely tales. They are the threads that keep us connected to the past. If you're still with us, we invite you to remain a little longer. This next part is the key to understanding how an army believed to be unstoppable began to wither in the middle of winter. We are about to look at the core of Mongol strength and the one weakness at its center. No army in history ever bound its soul to the horse the way the Mongols did. They did not simply ride horses, they lived on them, ate, slept, fought, traveled, and survived on horseback. A Mongol warrior was not a rider commanding a mount, but a living part of the herd. Each warrior traveled with 5 to 10 horses. When one tired, he switched to another, keeping the pace of the march unbroken, like an endless wind across the steppe. The horse gave them milk to drink, blood to endure famine, hide for armor, backbone for shields, bone for arrowheads, tendon for bowstrings. A warrior without a horse was no longer a warrior. He was simply a man, far from home, caught in a foreign winter. Poland understood this. They were not preparing to win a battle. They were preparing to dismantle what made the Mongols the Mongols. 3 months before the Mongols crossed the border, Duke Bolesław issued an order no European ruler had ever considered. Burn the pastures, salt the grazing fields, throw animal carcasses into the wells, destroy the stored grain, even as famine threatened their own people. This was not retreat. This was a sacrifice of the land, turning homeland into a deliberate wasteland. Summer fields were burned to ash. Seeds were buried deep beneath frozen soil, so that even the earth would not return life to the hands of the invader. They set traps in the very resources they had depended on. Then they left quietly, taking with them the only thing that mattered, the intention to return. Even old graveyards were unearthed, not to run, but to prevent the Mongols from grinding human bones into mineral feed for their horses, as they had done elsewhere. This was not a nation fleeing. This was a nation bleeding itself to strike at the artery of the enemy. And then came the final step. Cruel, yes, but not unnecessary. Purebred Polish horses, strong, beautiful, healthy, were left deliberately along the Mongol line of advance. Not tethered, not hidden, simply waiting, like an invitation. But they carried glanders, a disease that spreads through breath and blood, rots the lungs, fills the throat with pus, until the animal suffocates under the weight of its own breathing. A Mongol warrior would never pass up a strong horse. It was instinct, the instinct of survival and conquest. So the gift was accepted, without suspicion, without hesitation. 3 weeks later, the coughing began. Light at first, weariness next. Then it exploded like a storm. Necks swelled, breathing tightened, eyes clouded. Sweat froze under winter coats. Abscesses burst in rattling gasps, spattering the snow with sickly yellow foam. In an army where every warrior is a note in a single moving symphony, the melody broke. The herd had lost its rhythm. When the Mongols crossed the Vistula and pushed deeper inward, their scouts returned with a message no commander wanted to hear. No villages, no fields, no grazing land, no source of life. Not conquered, not abandoned, empty, deliberately, hollowed out. They could take nothing. They could not restore themselves on the march. The land refused to sustain them. The horses collapsed before the enemy ever appeared. And that was when the hunt began. There was no Polish army in sight, no war horns, no drums, only shadows moving in the tree line, slow, steady, unhurried. Because the hunted had begun to walk. When sickness began to spread through the herds, when the grass had burned to ash, when the wells held only black foam from rotting carcasses, the Mongols understood they were no longer on a campaign of conquest. They were lost, moving into a place where there was no road back. At first, they believed it was temporary. They had crossed deserts before. They had survived drought on the steppe. Horses could be replaced, supplies could be seized, water could be found. But here, the land gave nothing back, not by accident, by design. The first night of the hunt. At a small scouting camp, 5 horsemen tethered their mounts beside a line of pines. No one heard footsteps, no one saw shapes approach. Only when the final warm breath of a horse drifted out, pale as smoke in the night air, did they notice the cut across its throat. No shouts, no clash of blades, no men charging in. Only one thing happened. The horses died. The men were left alive. A Mongol warrior woke, touched the still warm reins, and froze like stone, because he understood. Without a horse, he was already dead. Only the dying would take longer. No one saw who did it. No footprints in the snow, no arrows in the trees, only the presence of a hunter who knew this land better than they did. An ambush without a battle. The small groups hiding in the woods did not attack men. They waited for the deep hour of the night, when campfires died down, when the watchman nodded once too long, when sleep was just heavy enough to betray the living. Then they moved, like the forest breathing. The blade did not tremble, did not rush, did not hesitate. One clean, silent line. By sunrise, the Mongols awoke to all their horses lying still. Blood spread into the snow, forming dark red halos, marks of someone who came and left without needing to be seen. There was no victory, there was no defeat, no honor, no chance for vengeance, only a message. We can kill you whenever we wish. We don't even need to see your face. This was not a battle. This was a declaration. The abandoned supplies and the curse hidden in spores. Poland left behind barrels of honey, sacks of dry grain, strips of wind-cured meat, as if abandoned in haste. The scouts read it as panic, but the commanders understood. In a war where the enemy is unseen, the enemy is whatever you must consume to survive. But hunger does not reason. The soldiers ate. By midnight, the camp groaned like the earth itself was cracking. No one died quickly. No one was spared. Bodies curled in on themselves, cold sweat gathering on eyelashes, stomachs twisting as if something were chewing from the inside. No one slept that night, and by morning, no one trusted the next mouthful of water. That was when the shadows of the forest no longer needed to strike. They only needed to wait. The mind breaks before the ranks. Once, the Mongols had terrified Europe so deeply that a mother needed only whisper, "The horsemen from the steppe are coming," and children went silent. But now, every night, the same warriors woke in fright, not from swords, not from arrows, but from the sound of snow falling on pine branches, like footsteps watching from the dark. Something in them shifted. They were no longer advancing. They were trying to escape. But the snow was deeper, the horses fewer, the roads longer, and the forests darker than before. They were not surrounding Poland. Poland was surrounding them. Before a single blade was drawn, the battle had already turned. Not because of violence, not because of numbers, not because of skill, but because the breath of the army had been taken away from inside its own chest. They were no longer marching. They were crawling. And in the woods, the farmers, the ones once dismissed as weak, had waited 19 years for this moment. The moment when the predator was finally too tired to run. When winter reached its sharpest, most merciless peak, the Mongol army, now with barely half its strength still able to stand, finally saw what they had been longing for through weeks of exhaustion. A European army standing before them. A long line of armoured riders, church banners swaying, curved shields catching pale light, helmets like steeples of iron, all standing still, as if the land and the men were one body. Not an ambush, not shadows in the dark, not knives slipping through horsetack at midnight. For the first time in months, the Mongols looked upon an enemy who stood visible before them, an enemy they could charge. And in that moment, a spark of battle spirit returned to their eyes. Cavalry. Old European horsemen. A lesson from 1241. Pray. Or so they thought. The Polish cavalry formed the front line, but they did not advance. They simply stood. In previous battles, all the Mongols needed to do was pretend to retreat, and Europe would chase, and chasing meant death. But this time, Europe did not chase. They did not move. They did not allow the distance to shift. This was not the Europe of 1241. Spears were planted deep into the ground, their points angled upward like a forest of steel. And behind those horsemen, beneath the snow, something else waited. The Mongol general gave the familiar command: feign retreat, then wheel around and fire. It was the tactic that had broken Europe 2 decades before. The light cavalry pulled back. Poland did not move. The light cavalry wheeled, accelerating into firing position. But when the horses' hooves struck the run path beneath the snow, the ground was not ground. It was trenches. It was pits. It was wide channels large enough to swallow a whole regiment, all covered with cut pine branches and a thin skin of snow. The first sound, then a deep wrenching thud, then screams. Horses plunged, legs snapped, bodies flipped, riders thrown into frozen bog layers of ice and mud. Warriors who had crossed deserts and valleys, who had ridden through Siberian whiteouts and Baikal grasslands, had never seen the earth itself become a traitor. From both flanks, Polish crossbowmen emerged, not running, not shouting. They walked, step by slow step, as if walking through a harvest field. Their bolts did not aim for chests, not for heads, not for sword arms. They aimed at the horses, because they understood. Killing one rider is the death of one man. Killing his horse is the death of 6. The rider, the spare rider, the archer who fights in motion, the scout who needs distance, the messenger who carries orders, the warrior whose identity comes from the saddle. The Mongols could not fight on foot. They were not infantry. They had never been infantry. Bolts tore tendons, hooves shattered, knees broke against ice like stone struck by hammer. The greatest cavalry the world had ever known now stood in the open field without legs. No battle cries, no heroic stands, no triumphant hymns. Only a truth cold as iron. They were not losing a battle. They were losing the essence of who they were. And in that moment, the Mongols finally understood. They were not being defeated by swords or spears or numbers. They were being defeated by something they had never feared: patience, memory, the hatred of a people who had learned to wait in silence for 20 years. The battle at Sandomierz was not the height of bloodshed. It was the height of internal collapse. For when an army that lives by speed is forced to stand still, winter becomes the final executioner. When the field at Sandomierz pinned the Mongol cavalry on weak ice and among their dying horses, the last figures to appear on that field were not knights nor royal armies. They were farmers, people with no crests, no titles, no pages of chronicles bearing their names, only hands hardened by labor, shoulders shaped by ploughing, and 20 years of grief carved into memory. They did not come for glory. They came to settle a debt of blood. When the Mongol horses fell, and the warriors no longer had the second pair of legs that made them who they were, the battle was already ending. But the Poles did not draw swords. They changed tools. They carried what had sustained them all their lives: the sickle for cutting grain, the hammer used for shaping horseshoes, the wooden flail for threshing autumn harvests, the hay hook for gathering straw in the barn. Tools never forged to kill, yet so familiar in the hand that they needed no training to become decisive. When a person has been pushed to the limits of loss, anything in their grasp can become the final instrument. The farmers did not charge. They walked, slow, even, like stepping into the morning fields at dawn. No orders given, no signals needed. They had waited for this moment for 20 years. They knew what to do. The Mongols tried to form a defensive circle, a formation that had once endured storms of arrows and walls of spears. But that formation was meant for cavalry on horseback, not for men forced to stand on failing legs and exhausted muscle. They were no longer an army built for battle, only an assembly of individuals holding on to the instinct to survive. A sickle does not stab. A sickle sweeps. A farmer does not strike one blow at a time. He works in rhythm, in arcs, as though cutting through a field of wheat. At Sandomierz, what fell to the ground was not grain, but the remnants of a terror once cast across Europe. The hammer did not aim for force, it aimed for certainty, not to finish quickly, but to stop movement, and then to end silence. No frenzy, no roaring. This was not rage, this was labor that had come into season. They were not used to fighting in cold wind without the saddle. They were not used to facing an enemy unconcerned with honor or heroic death. They were not used to those who did not seek a duel, only an ending. On that snow-covered field, the army once called the thunder of the steppe became a flock of birds with broken wings. No flight path, no return trail, only white ground and strained breath. When the sounds finally faded, the field did not celebrate. No victory procession, no triumphant song. Only snow continued to fall, and the farmers knelt, hands touching the earth, as though touching the chest of someone long gone. They did not weep. The tears had already been shed, years before, when their villages burned, when their families vanished, when hoofbeats were once the sound of doom. Now, they simply nodded, like a craftsman finishing his work, like a father keeping a promise, An army does not always die on the battlefield. Sometimes it dies in the memory of those it once scarred. Europe did not win through the sword. It won through time, memory, and the will to never forget. After Sandomierz, the Mongol army was no longer the hunter. They had become wanderers, carrying the weight of a journey that no longer had a destination. They left the White Plains behind and turned toward the Carpathian Mountains, the only path left to take. But Carpathia was not a route of escape. Carpathia was a door sealed shut by cold wind and silence. No footprints ahead, no towns to rest in, no pastures to restore strength. Only deep forests, narrow passes, and a sky white as an endless burial shroud. The Mongols were not infantry. They were born on horseback. They saw the battlefield from above. They measured wind by the saddle, lived to the rhythm of hooves. And now, they walked. Slow. On aching knees, with worn-out souls, with breaths that burned the lungs in mountain air. A warrior who once rode from Lake Baikal to the Danube now struggled to climb a single icy slope. Not because he was weak, but because what made him who he was had been taken away. On the first day they spoke little. On the third day they rationed. On the sixth day they chewed the last dried scraps of horsehide. By the eighth day they stopped counting days. In war there are two kinds of death: the death of injury, quick, visible, and the death of the body slowly consuming itself from the inside. Here, the second death ruled. No blood spilled, only bodies quietly turning inward, using themselves as their final source of life. In the mountain forests, the highland villagers had heard the news. They are coming. They are hungry. They will eat anything that is still alive. And so they prepared, not with fortresses, not with grand armies, but with methods simple and merciless. Stones rolled onto mountain passes, bridges burned, streams redirected to freeze footpaths into glass. And then they waited. In Carpathia, time is the hunter. No bow required, no spear. Only the endless night and the cold that does not tire. One Mongol detachment, 500 men, made camp in a sheltered valley. Supplies gone, men collapsing. No one had the strength to bury the dead. They laid their comrades down in the snow as if placing them into bed. Night came again. No songs, no prayers, only eyes reflecting the slow dying of the fire. By morning, there was only ash, white ground, and a silence as if the earth had stopped breathing. A survivor scratched onto a strip of hide. We were once thunder. Now we are only an echo that has lost its way home. No more cavalry. No more army. Only individuals holding on, one day to the next, without knowing why. By the end of winter, the remaining groups could no longer outpace even the wolves. They carried hunger with them, and hunger carried the sound of their steps. And the mountain people did one thing. They followed. No need to strike, no need to confront, no need to draw a weapon. Just follow, because winter would finish the work. End of part 6. It was not Poland that won through duel, not crossbows, nor spears, nor blades. It was winter, silence, waiting, memory that did not fade. An army died before it ever saw the road home. When the last ice melted on the slopes of the Carpathians, the survivors of the Mongol host were no longer horsemen of the steppe. They were simply those who returned, carrying on their bodies the marks of a winter that no one was ever meant to survive. They walked east like shadows that had forgotten their own shapes. No drums to announce them, no trumpets of triumph, only silence. Some returned and never spoke of Poland. Some returned with hands curled inward, as if still holding the warmth they fought to keep. Some never returned at all. And on the steppe, where people once believed Mongols could not be defeated, a question surfaced. One no one had dared to say aloud before. If an army can be defeated not by sword, but by earth and time, then what is true strength? It was the first crack in the myth of invincibility. It did not echo, it did not roar, but it never healed. News of victory did not arrive in Europe like celebration. It came like a quiet breath, passing through monasteries, village squares, family hearths. They can be defeated. No master swordsman required. No grand crusading charge. No heavy Western armor clanging like cathedral bells. Only the willingness to wait, the ability to remember, the clarity to strike where the enemy does not think he can be struck. Europe learned. Not all victories come from the clash of steel. Some come simply from outlasting fear. There were no grand parades, no cavalry displays, no monuments raised. The farmers returned to the exact places they had left: the field, the old stone well, the draughty barn, the first shoots of spring grass. A man took the dry soil he had carried from home the day he departed and scattered it into the new furrow, as one might whisper back to the earth, "I have returned, you have returned, we begin again." No one stood there to praise him. No chronicle recorded his name, but the soil remembered, and that was enough. History is not only written by empires and armies, it is also written by calloused hands that no one names. The one who buries seeds in snow instead of abandoning them, the one who stands still when the enemy expects a charge, the one who holds pain quietly instead of letting it rot, the one who returns history only its rightful due. An empire does not fall in a single battle, but it begins to fall the moment those it once terrified stop trembling. If this story has stirred something in you, not about war itself, but about the quiet endurance of ordinary people beneath the weight of history, then we invite you to continue with us into the next journeys where we search for the moments when history turns. Not because someone shouted loudest, but because someone waited the longest. Thank you for walking through that winter with us.